there.
Approaches to education and the way we introduce learning to the youngest, and also the way that we work with learning throughout childhood and into adulthood, it varies tremendously across the globe. In today's session, we're going to compare and contrast different approaches. We're going to focus mostly on Europe, and more specifically Scandinavia, which is where I was born, specifically in Denmark. So we're going to focus mostly on that, but also talk about some of the different approaches you will find within the European Union. We're going to start by having a look at the path forward for youngsters in Denmark and the options that they have going forward. So first of all, Danish children, they begin public daycare as early as 9 months. And this is something you can find in many other countries as well. And essentially, by the age of 3, almost 100% of children in Denmark are attending public kindergartens. And in the kindergartens, you will find professionals who've taken an education where they specialized in training in the early childhood education. So what do they work with? Well, not surprisingly, they introduce the most basic of concepts, the notion of letters. They introduce the alphabet, pronunciations of simple words. It kind of follows the traditional thing. But one thing which is super interesting is a lot of emphasis is on social well-being, interaction with children around them is emphasized a lot in the early years. Things like turn-taking, so respecting other children's time, respecting your own time. So you will frequently find the time as something being worked on. That is, I have my time, you have your time. We need to respect one another's time. That's an interesting thing being worked very early on. And the environment as a whole is obviously very playful. So most things are centered around play, free play of different things, inventing fun things, interacting as much as you can with the youngest, of course. During the late spring and summer and early autumn, a lot of activities outdoors where you do discovery activities with the children. They get to see plants and trees and everything around them up front. A little bit later on today, we're going to have a look at some of the first books, by the way, that children are introduced to as well. So around the age of 6, 5 for some, because parents can insist on that, but generally around the age of 6, Danish children begin their formal schooling. The approach in Denmark is quite different as compared to what happens in the United Kingdom and in France, for example. So in Denmark, we use the Scandinavian model. That is a model that is similar between the countries of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, which is that class rankings and formal tests are avoided at almost all costs. Danish children, it takes them a very long time before they have their first tests, and children are not being ranked in any way or form. There's a lot of emphasis on group work, and again there is that coming back to turn-taking. So very early on, children learn to work in groups, to interact with other children and listen to other children. That's being emphasized a lot in the early years. Another thing is that the environment, generally speaking, is incredibly informal. Again, compared to certain German schools, French schools, and schools in the United Kingdom, you would expect their teachers to be called by their last name, Mr. and last name, or something similar. Not so in Denmark, first name only. Everybody is first name. So it's quite an informal setting. The focus in the early years is on problem solving, not memorization. So those of you who know the history of learning and teaching will know that we've come from all information being essentially available in Latin, so exclusively for speakers of Latin. And then it became the study of literary works, the great works of famous writers that you would then study, and then you would translate that when we're talking about learning a second language, for example. And then there was a long period of like pure memorization, and then came more modern approaches that involves discovery and analysis, and those things, communicative approaches, and so on and so forth. So we've come a long way, and memorization in the Danish school system is not present except for what's considered common knowledge, like things that you're expected to know. We're going to talk more about that a little bit later. I want to talk briefly about what comes next. So in Denmark, we have something called folkeskole, which means the people's school, and that's a place that children study a number of different subjects until they're 16 years old. It is possible to put your child in a private school in Scandinavia, but there are not that many private schools. Most of the private schools present, they offer cater specifically for either Jewish, Christian, or Muslims that look for schools that take that into the school curriculum. There's some international schools as well that can emphasize other aspects, but by and large, we're probably talking about 80-85% of children or slightly above go to the folkeskole, the people's school, which is a public school, tuition free. Then, just briefly mentioning what comes next, what's the path, just so you know that. Essentially, when the elementary school is over, there is a nationwide test, and that test is sort of directed to help students choose between two main directions. One is an academic direction, which means that students will go to what's called the gymnasium here, which is referred to as high school in English. And in that school, there's a focus on language and science and math. The other direction is a more practically oriented direction in which you can go to something called trade school. And there you will work with things like metalworking, electrical technology, mechanics, business school, etc. Sort of two very different directions there. The distribution today is probably half and half, maybe slightly more choose the gymnasium/high school path. I also wanted to mention that after high school, there's the option obviously of going to university, which is also tuition free in Scandinavia. Remember, when I say tuition free, you have to remember that we have an extremely high tax rate in Scandinavia. It hovers around 50%. So 50% of all your income is paid to public authorities that then redistribute and make decisions for you. And one of the decisions they make is that education in your country is free. But it's more than free. In fact, if you choose to study at university later on, you're entitled to receiving money from the public authorities. It's not a huge salary or something like that, but it does help during your studies, and you can get that up to in a 5-year period. I just wanted to let you know as well that there are many options for people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, all the way to retirement to take supplemental courses. And there's a high emphasis among Danish workplaces to pay for their employees additional training, which I think is a great thing. It's also worth noting that we have what is called like people's education, especially for the elderly. So if you want to get into something like cooking class or foreign languages or music, you can do so throughout your entire life. I'd like very briefly to talk a little bit about European schooling and learning approaches, especially for the youngest ones. Especially in a country fairly far away, such as Brazil, we tend to think of Europe as a unit, as a single entity. And it's important to note that although we have a European Union, which by the way is under pressure, it's not going super well in some aspects, but just because you have a union doesn't mean that the individual countries have the same approaches to solving problems. related to basically anything. And when it comes to learning and teaching and approaches to learning, it's not an exception. So you will find that countries such as Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, Greenland pretty much share their educational system, like their starting points. And you will find other countries, I mentioned some of them, Germany in general, certainly countries in the United Kingdom, certainly France and parts of Spain, Italy, have a different approach. And what that actually means is you can kind of set it up so you have two groups. They're just about the same size, I should say. And on the one hand, you have parents and teachers argue that children should not be academically tested when they're 4 years old or younger. They don't need that pressure. It's too early. And another large group saying that no, we need to introduce testing at an early age. It's vital for the development of children. And so this is a hot potato, I think, not just in Europe but around the world, because those are two pretty contrasting viewpoints. When we're talking about Scandinavia, then it's pretty much like this. The main focus is on play, and whatever happens in the classroom in the earliest years, but actually all the way throughout their school life, play, the playful environment is key. Another very interesting thing that differs, especially from the United Kingdom, is that the parents, they get sort of a more holistic progress report on their children. So where you would expect the United Kingdom a lot of focus on actual grades and performance in the individual subjects in school, in Scandinavia, teachers will mention that, of course, but there will be a lot more emphasis on behavior, respecting other students, time. We talked about turn taking, their social intelligence, if you'd like, social ability to interact with other students is something that's a lot of focus on. So that's really quite interesting. Another thing which is a tension point is, what are we supposed to teach and at which age? So traditionally in Scandinavia, you leave things like money, finance, business, certain things of math, you leave that to the later years in elementary school. But there is a push, especially in the United Kingdom, to introduce things like business and finance concepts quite early on. Some studies show that things like earning, saving, managing money can actually be introduced at a very early age through play. And there's a push for that in the United Kingdom. In Scandinavia, much less so. As somebody who was born in Denmark, I would say that the aspects of, for example, managing a business or opening a company or being an entrepreneur is something that simply isn't touched upon in the early years, and even later on, I should say, it really isn't part of it. So there's a strong emphasis on what I would call traditional academia. We talk about Sweden, for example. This video is being recorded in Sweden, very similar to the situation in Denmark. A couple of keywords. Swedish children are encouraged to be creative while still learning academic basics. So creativity is stimulated a lot in Sweden. Keyword again, they should learn in a playful, fun manner. A lot of educational games, acting, and song. That's actually interesting, that even in science classes, physics classes, in the early years, singing can be part of that. So that's kind of interesting as well. Other attributes such as perseverance, independence, and problem solving are being emphasized as essential parts of children's development. So some of the key words are quite interesting. I want to talk a little bit about the kind of subjects that Danish students are introduced to throughout the early years. So what you're seeing here are a list of subject matters written in Danish. But I'll help as we move forward very, very fast. So all of these are not introduced at the age of 6, but many of them are. But let's have a quick look at them. So this is actually 9 years of schooling in Denmark, elementary school. These are the things that all students will see. A couple of things can be are optional. We'll get to that. So Billedkunst is the arts. So the ability and the study of arts, drawing, all kinds of different art forms are being studied. And that's introduced very early on. So to stimulate creativity, children are put in arts classes. So we're not studying the history of art. We're not studying Kandinsky, right? We're studying creativity, and get a paintbrush in your hand, doing watercolor painting, stuff like that, very early on. Then we have biology, which is a part. We have, of course, Danish as the first language. We have Danish as a second language because we have a lot of foreigners in the country. English is generally introduced in the 4th or the 5th grade. That's optional for school. French is optional in the 8th or 9th grade. Physics and chemistry, back in the old days, was introduced in the 7th, 8th grade, but now physics and chemistry are actually available in the 5th and 6th grade. Geography introduced in the 4th and 5th grade. History normally introduced in the 2nd or 3rd grade already. We have something called håndværk and design, which is the ability to work with your hands. So you'll be able to sew, for example, and use pencil to make fairly advanced drawings. You'll understand a little bit about history of arts as well, but mostly it's a hands-on. So again, it's an extension actually of Billedkunst, the first one where we're focusing on arts and paintings. In håndværk and design, we're doing more stuff, and that's typically the 4th and 5th grade as well. Idræt means physical education. That's available from the 1st grade. Here's a fun one that might be a surprise to some. Kristendomskundskab, that is the study of religion. It's not Bible reading, but it's the study of different religions. And basically 2 groups. So you have traditional religions, so you understand the Muslim community, the Christian community, the Jewish community, and so on and so forth. And you also study the religion of Native Americans, for example, or the Inuit people, and so on and so forth. So two groups, quite interesting study. It has a historical approach there. The next one is another fun one, madkundskab. That is the study of making food. So how do we prepare healthy food in our homes? Quite interesting. Introduced on the 4th and 5th grade. And also, how do we deal with the product itself, the raw materials? So you would have a class about the dangers of salmonella poisoning with chicken, for example. So you'd have that. Music introduced as early on as 1st grade. We have nature and technology being introduced in the 4th, 5th, or 6th grade. Samfundsfag talks about society in general, how society works. Both Spanish and German can be they're optional choices, typically in the 7th, 8th, or 9th grade. So those are the things being worked in a typical Scandinavian school. So it's quite diverse, and a couple of things that you might not find in Brazil and South America in general. I wanted to show you something about the kinds of inputs or the kinds of books that you could expect for the youngest. So we're looking at materials here available for children in the 1st grade, potentially 2nd grade. So we're talking about children ages 5, 6, and 7. As is the case in Brazil today, there's a combination of digital resources and traditional books. That's still the case in Scandinavia. I think Scandinavians are quite conservative when it comes to use of books. I think we treasure books a lot, physical books, paper books, and they're still being used a lot despite the push to go online 100%. It's about a mix these days. Here's a popular book series. It's called First Facts, and the first series there's called various things. And then the second one's called First Facts, Animals and Nature. That's a group. We have a First Fact subgroup called Society and History. So it's interesting. So here we're talking about books for children who are 5 and 6 generally, right? Another First Facts, Technique and Science there. So that's a whole series. And it's quite interesting. Here's just an example of one here. This is studying about the Chihuahua. You need to know about the Chihuahua, right? So this is an example where you do a case study on a specific dog breed, and they introduce to the history of that dog breed, and you can expand. The teacher can expand that, of course. So that's a fun one. And here's another one. Here's a book for children about what do you do if there's an accident at home. You dial 112 in this part of the world. So if you dial 112 in Denmark, you are referred to the police. They can send you a police car, or they can send you an ambulance if you have an accident. So again, a fun thing, hands-on. Here's another one about dogs. And here you can see that the First Fact series, which is quite popular in Denmark for the youngest, it's pretty much a study of different things that you can see around you in real life. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can see there's a book about ladybugs. Everybody needs to know about ladybugs, of course. Why horses are fantastic. There's one about that. There's one about the police. That's a fun one. And a super useful one here about knights. So you're going to study about knights in the past. What do pilots do? You need to know about bats, obviously. There's the Chihuahua again. And yeah, many fun ones. Spiders, chicken, and snakes, and so on and so forth. And so discover the world through pictures. With the pictures, there's simple words, simple phrases, and then the teacher plays games, and they try to guess things, and they create stories with the ladybug and the horse and the pilot and the bat and so on and so forth. So the introduction, so just to recap, so the introduction is, it's playful, it's about games, it's about respecting other people's time, developing social abilities, and that's a theme that runs throughout all of elementary school and beyond. Let's have a quick look at, we're gonna just go to the 7th grade super fast and see what do Danish children study in the 7th grade in their first language. So here we have it, and there's a quick overview here on your screen. And there's a warm-up activity, like what did you do in your vacation? It talks about style. Danish is introduced essentially where you work with the spoken and the written word, very similar to other approaches. And then there's a mixture of common knowledge, style, formality, how to write, what you write, why you write different things, and just take a quick dive in and have a quick look. Here's a fun way, the way things are introduced. I thought that was quite interesting. So there's definitely elements from the task-based framework in the way it's approached. Here, for example, there are a couple of tasks for students to do. Your local library at the beginning of the school year are inviting students to talk about what they did in their vacation. The topic is family and vacation. Both adults and children are asked to talk about their vacation. Please write down keywords, prepare to talk about your vacation, and we're going to record it. So in this particular activity, each student will prepare with keywords. They're not going to write everything down. They're just going to use the keywords. They go to the board and they do a presentation, which is recorded on video, analyzed. Then, of course, the parents can see that later on. So that's one task. Task 2, write an email to a friend you know very well about vacation. Write about what you've been doing, who you've been together with, what was the coolest thing. There's also the famous gap fill. There are moments where students are asked to consider things, compare and contrast things, which is an important element. There's a lot of that from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade and up. Here's a fun one in under 3. Are there any things that you told your friend but you wouldn't feel comfortable telling in public at the library? So putting thoughts to things you're not comfortable with. So interesting elements as well. It continues here. Would you say in general that there are situations where we decide what to say to who, and why do we do that? And can you give examples? So here's an example where we are going 1, 2, 3. We're being very abstract. We're being very tangible in the beginning, and then we move towards more abstract tasks, which is a common feature as our learners get more and more mature, of course. Another thing which is interesting, obviously, is that comparing and contrasting and analyzing is a common theme throughout most school years. In this particular exercise here, we're asking students again in the 7th grade to analyze sentences and then rank them in terms of formality. And we have 3 sentences here. Matthias thinks that Emilia is very beautiful. Number 2, Matthias believes that Emilia is adorable. And Matthias thinks that Emilia is super hot. And then students are asked to compare and contrast what are the differences. When would you say something? When wouldn't you say it? And then there is a more detailed analysis going forward. There's a picture of our aging queen. By the way, she's 81 years by now, but still hanging in there. Now, one more thing I think is interesting to note is that although the approach to education in Scandinavia is very progressive, it's very modern, there's still a couple of things where it looks old school, where we kind of, it may be old-fashioned, but that's the way it is. Here's an example. Common knowledge, things that you're supposed to know. From the 5th grade, 6th and up, we're starting to build in school a database of knowledge that, despite that the Scandinavian model does not incentivize memorization, it does. Here's some memorization, things you need to know. So let's have a look at what you need to know when you're in the 7th grade here, and it's kind of fun. You need to know who the President of the United States is. You need to know if the President of the United States likes certain foods. I don't know why that's important, but it's in the book. Maybe it's for fun. Which mammal is the fastest in the world? You need to know about spelling. You need to know the colors of the flag of Namibia, the country on the African continent. I don't know those, by the way. What is the name of the Danish football coach? You need to know that. Can you live without eating anything? I think there is an organization in Brazil called Living on Light. So yes, some people apparently can live without eating it. They say so. What's the name of the Prime Minister in Denmark? What is a vegetarian? You need to know that in 7th grade in Denmark. Yeah, so a long list of things you need to know. So again, we do not believe in rote learning. We do not believe in memorization. But still, there come certain things. There's certain things you should know. And there is some memorization, especially in things like geography, right? You need to be able to find certain things on a map. So we come to the end of a quick overview of some of the approaches and attitudes towards learning, especially in the younger years in Scandinavia, and more specifically Denmark. And I compiled a list of keywords that I believe are the most important words in the way the approaches to learning sort of work for us in this part of the world. And they are to see, to touch, to play, to sing, to discover, to imagine, to create, to explore, to compare, and ultimately comprehend. Thank you very much for participating in today's class. Bye-bye.
Hi.
Hi there.